The Senate chamber isn't usually a place for fireworks, but today it's less like a legislative floor and more like a live broadcast cage match. At the center of the storm, Senator Tim Scott and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett locked in a standoff over a sprawling $180 billion housing and disaster relief package. On paper, it's about rebuilding communities shattered by hurricanes, wildfires, and economic collapse. In reality, it's about political will and the millions of lives hanging in the balance. The bill's promise: direct relief for displaced families, rent caps in crisis zones, and accelerated rebuilding in neglected rural and urban districts. The obstacle: Scott's adamant push to strip the rent control provisions, calling them a socialist chokehold on the free market. His words slice through the chamber microphones. We don't need to shackle our economy to failed policies in the name of compassion. It's a sound bite tailor-made for evening news, and a direct shot at Crockett, the bill's most vocal champion. She doesn't flinch, not even when cameras zoom in for the reaction shot. Instead, she leans forward, hands clasped, and says in a tone that could freeze water, "Try telling that to the families living in tents outside what used to be their homes." The room shifts. Even veteran reporters lean forward. This isn't a procedural squabble. It's the beginning of a national clash, where every sentence will be clipped, captioned, and dissected by millions. Outside the chamber, protesters gather, signs lifted high. Homes, not politics. Rent relief now. The nation isn't just watching. They're waiting to see who walks out of this fight holding the moral high ground. And if Scott thought this was going to be another polite policy disagreement, Crockett's steady gaze says otherwise. This will be a battle measured not in committee votes, but in public trust. By the next morning, the Capitol is a hive. Headlines scream about the Scott-Crockett showdown, and every political panel in America is chewing on the same question. Is this about economics or empathy? Tim Scott, making the rounds on cable news, frames the bill as reckless spending disguised as relief, warning it will burden future generations while rewarding dependency. The phrasing is deliberate, sharp enough to please fiscal hawks, dismissive enough to rile Crockett's base. Jasmine, for her part, skips the studio circuit. Instead, she's in the flood-scarred Gulf Coast, standing on a street still lined with the skeletons of homes gutted by last year's storms. The air smells faintly of mildew and burnt wood. Residents gather, some still in FEMA trailers, listening as she lays out exactly what the bill would do for them. Rent stabilization so landlords can't price gouge disaster survivors, grants to rebuild schools, and tax breaks for small businesses reopening in recovery zones. We're not talking about handouts, she tells them. We're talking about a bridge back to stability. Her words are recorded on dozens of phones, and within hours the footage floods social media, racking up millions of views. But the real heat comes from a leaked hallway exchange captured by an intern's phone in which Scott tells a colleague, "If we give her this win, she'll ride it straight into the next election." It's meant to be private strategy, but once it's out, the implication is clear. This isn't just about policy, it's about power. For Crockett, it's an opening, proof that her opponent's objections are rooted less in principle and more in political calculus. And for the millions watching at home, the fight over this bill is no longer abstract. It's personal, a tug of war over whether their lives are bargaining chips in Washington's endless games. The leaked remark detonates like a political landmine, sending shockwaves through both parties' back rooms. By lunchtime, hashtags like #, not a bargaining chip, and #, pass the relief bill are climbing the charts. Talk radio hosts dissect the ethics of holding disaster aid hostage for political leverage, and late-night comedians turn Scott's "give her this win" into a punchline looped over B-roll of wrecked neighborhoods. Scott's office scrambles, releasing a carefully worded statement insisting his concerns are purely about fiscal responsibility, but the damage is already deep. Meanwhile, Jasmine seizes the moment with the precision of a seasoned fighter. Standing on the steps of a half-collapsed community center, she addresses the leak without theatrics. If fighting for families is a political win, then I hope we all win. The line is equal parts humility and gut punch, instantly replayed on every major network. Volunteers behind her hold up blueprints for rebuilding, a visual counterpoint to Scott's abstract economic warnings. That night, she joins a virtual town hall with disaster survivors from 3 states, letting them tell their stories while she listens, interjecting only to explain how the bill addresses each problem in plain, no-nonsense language. Clips from the call go viral not because she's attacking Scott, but because she's humanizing a policy fight that most Americans would otherwise tune out. The optics are devastating for her opponent. She's in the trenches with victims, he's in marble hallways parsing budget lines. Political strategists note the momentum shift. Even some moderate Republicans privately admit Scott underestimated her. And somewhere in the noise, a new question takes root among voters. If he's willing to gamble with relief now, what happens when the next disaster strikes? The answer, Crockett seems determined to show, will not be decided behind closed doors. It will be fought for in the open, with every camera rolling. By midweek, the standoff has turned into a national litmus test, a fight that every pundit, mayor, and late-night barstool debater suddenly feels qualified to weigh in on. Jasmine's allies in the House push the bill through committee with lightning speed, framing it as emergency medicine for a country still limping from a decade of storms, fires, and housing crises. Scott, sensing the ground shifting under him, doubles down on the fiscal alarm bells. At a press conference flanked by charts and economic advisors, he warns of runaway inflation and crippling debt, his delivery crisp but clinical. The numbers look impressive on the easel, but outside, protesters chant loud enough to bleed into the microphones, "People over profit! Relief now!" Meanwhile, Jasmine stages her own counter-programming, an impromptu press gaggle inside a half-repaired high school gym, the scent of fresh paint still hanging in the air. She's surrounded by students whose homes were destroyed, and she lets them speak first. A teenage girl describes doing homework in a motel parking lot because her family's been in temporary housing for 8 months. A boy talks about his father losing their small grocery store after a hurricane wiped out the power grid for weeks. When Jasmine finally takes the mic, her voice is steady but edged with fire. If Senator Scott thinks these kids can wait for political convenience, he should tell them himself. The clip races through social media, paired side by side with Scott's sterile graphs. The visual contrast is brutal. Human faces against faceless data, and even political independents start weighing in that they'd rather see results than rhetoric. Cable news frames it as a battle of worlds, one rooted in lived reality, the other in economic theory. And for the first time, whispers inside the Senate suggest Scott may have overplayed his hand, giving Crockett a platform that's growing by the hour. The bill's fate is now more than legislation. It's a referendum on whose definition of leadership the nation believes in. Thursday dawns with the kind of political tension that pulls every camera crew within 100 miles to the Capitol steps. Rumors swirl that Scott might introduce a compromise version of the relief bill, one stripped of rent caps and direct aid, replaced with tax incentives and block grants. His team frames it as a fiscally responsible alternative, but to Crockett and her supporters, it's a hollowed-out shell designed to look like action while leaving the hardest-hit communities twisting in the wind. Before Scott can even unveil the proposal, Jasmine takes the offensive. In a packed committee hearing broadcast live, she dismantles the compromise point by point, weaving personal stories from constituents into cold, inescapable facts. "You can't rebuild a home with a tax credit when you don't have an income," she says, her words hanging heavy in the silence that follows. Even a few Republican senators shift uncomfortably in their seats. Outside, the protests swell into the thousands, with crowds chanting her name between demands for a full bill. News drones capture the scale from above, blocks of people filling the avenues like a living, breathing mandate. Scott finally steps to the podium to pitch his version, but the optics are grim. He's interrupted multiple times by chants bleeding in from the street. In the evening's news cycle, Jasmine's fiery takedown dominates headlines, while Scott's proposal is largely framed as a retreat. Polling firms release snap surveys showing public support for the original bill climbing past 60%, with a notable surge among suburban voters who rarely engage in such debates. Political strategists start whispering that Scott's in a corner. If he caves, he hands her the win outright. If he digs in, he risks being cast as the man who blocked relief when the country needed it most. And Jasmine? She's already planning her next move. Knowing momentum this strong can't be wasted. By Friday, momentum has tipped so far in Jasmine's favor that even seasoned Capitol reporters admit they haven't seen a policy fight flip this decisively in years. Overnight, videos of her committee hearing speech rack up millions of views, splicing her sharpest lines over images of wrecked neighborhoods and volunteers in hard hats. Grassroots donations pour into her campaign at record pace, accompanied by messages like, "For the families you fought for," and "Don't let them water it down." Scott's allies quietly express frustration that his office underestimated her ability to turn a policy battle into a populist cause. In closed-door meetings, some suggest finding a way to exit gracefully before the damage becomes permanent. But Scott, ever the polished debater, isn't ready to yield. He appears on a primetime news slot, arguing that Crockett's bill sacrifices long-term stability for short-term applause. It's a clean, controlled performance, until the host plays a clip of a flood victim asking on live TV, "Why does my survival have to wait for their politics?" The juxtaposition is brutal, and Scott's smile tightens as the segment cuts to commercial. Meanwhile, Jasmine is in the Midwest, standing in front of a half-rebuilt nursing home, delivering an impromptu address to a small crowd. She doesn't mention Scott by name. She doesn't have to. Every story she tells about residents stranded without care is an implicit indictment of his position. Local news eats it up, and by the time she boards her flight back to D.C., "Number Stand with Jasmine" is the top trend nationwide. The fight is no longer just legislative. It's become symbolic, a public test of who will bend first under the weight of national scrutiny. And from the look in her eyes as she lands, Crockett has no intention of being the one to break. The following Monday, the Senate chamber is standing room only, the air thick with anticipation. Protesters outside have swelled into a sea of signs, their chants reverberating through the marble walls. Inside, every seat on the press balcony is taken, cameras locked on the floor as the relief bill comes up for its decisive vote. Scott delivers a final speech, polished and precise, warning of a dangerous precedent for unchecked spending. It's met with polite applause from his caucus, but the energy in the room shifts when Jasmine rises. She doesn't bring papers, charts, or talking points, just her voice and the weight of the stories she's carried for weeks. "We've heard about precedent," she says, her tone steady. "Here's the real precedent. If we walk away from this, we tell every American family hit by disaster that survival is a luxury they have to earn." The chamber falls silent, except for the rhythmic clicking of press cameras. She closes by inviting every senator to meet the people she's fought for, to see their lives before deciding their fate. When the votes are tallied, the bill passes, narrowly, but with enough bipartisan support to mark it as a political earthquake. Outside, cheers erupt, echoing across the Capitol grounds. Reporters swarm Jasmine, but she waves them off, choosing instead to walk into the crowd of relief advocates who've been camped outside for days. The images of her hugging tearful families are beamed across the nation within minutes. For Scott, the loss is more than legislative. It's a public relations defeat that will shadow him into the next election cycle. For Jasmine, it's the moment her profile transforms from rising star to national force. And for the millions of Americans who stood to lose everything, it's proof that fights like these matter. If you want to keep seeing the stories that shape the future and the people who refuse to back down, make sure you hit subscribe and stay with us. The next battle is already on the horizon.